Hey YouTube, how's it going? I've been thinking today about, well, I mean I've been thinking for a long time about why cannabis is illegal, but I thought today I would share my thoughts with you. It's kind of prompted by a visit to a man about a dog, which I'll get to later in this video, but I've got some kind of points to go over. So, my boyfriend's a liberal Democrat to be specific, and he has this quote which he kind of holds to in all things, which is that you need no reason at all, no good reason at all for something to be legal, but you need a very good reason to make it illegal. And I think that that's relevant when it comes to cannabis use. We're talking about something which grows naturally on the planet, which has been used since 19 AD by billions of people with no recorded fatalities. The argument that the government repeatedly gives for the reason that it's illegal is that it's potentially dangerous to people with mental illnesses. People with a predisposition to certain mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, will have those triggered by drug use. I just wonder kind of if that's a good enough reason to make it illegal for all users, considering the massively detrimental effects that alcohol has on people with mental illnesses as a depressant. But similarly, other things that spark schizophrenia and people with a predisposition are things like moving out of home and going to university for the first time. You find a lot of people with a predisposition for schizophrenia develop schizophrenia around about the age of 20, 21, because that's when they're going out to university and they're having all the pressures of living away from home for the first time with the added pressures of the academic kind of achievement. So why don't we just make going to university illegal if it's a good enough reason to make something illegal because of the But I mean, the hypocrisy of that as they charge happily away their tax on the alcohol just seems to me disgusting. As someone who has suffered pretty severe alcohol poisoning at some point, as most people probably do at some point in their lives, that's how you learn not to drink 14 tequila shots. And someone who's smoked cannabis since 15, I can honestly say that alcohol is a much more dangerous substance in my opinion. Particularly in the view of, like, a couple of years ago in London, there was a spate of weed which was washed in ground glass or silicon beads that were ground up to make it weigh more, and it seemed like everything you got, it became like, once the word started to spread in the drug using community, it became like a thing to bite the weed between your teeth to make sure you couldn't feel grit between your teeth, because if you feel grit or sand, that's silicon dust. That might come back to haunt me. I smoked some of that weed, you know, on repeated occasions during that time. That might actually come back to haunt me in later life, silicon poisoning. I feel like if cannabis had been a legal drug to begin with, like alcohol or like cigarettes, that quality could have been regulated, so that, you know, millions of people in the UK didn't have their health put at risk when they're doing something which doesn't put their own health immediately at risk or the health of other people around them at risk, any more than, say, cigarettes or drinking or, you know, playing loud music. Another argument that the government will give is that cannabis is a gateway drug, and I completely agree with that cannabis is definitely a gateway drug. A gateway drug means that you take that drug, and because you take that drug, you're more likely to go on to use other drugs. I would completely agree with that, and this is another good reason to make cannabis legal. When I was a 15-year-old, innocently smoking a bit of weed in the park, having the time of my life, looking at the clouds and trying to work out what the shapes looked like, and laughing my arse off when I first started smoking. I didn't have any interest in ever touching any other drugs, but there were two things about smoking cannabis that led me on to taking other drugs, and that is that because the government and adults always told me cannabis is a drug. Drugs are bad. If you do drugs, you'll die, or you'll cut your skin off your arm with a potato peeler because you're tripping and you don't know what's going on, or you'll jump off the building or something. When I realised that that was complete bullshit, because I was smoking weed and nothing was bad was happening, and I didn't have any urge to hurt anyone else or get into fights or do anything antisocial apart from smoking the weed itself, I realised that much of that advice couldn't be trusted. And then I started to wonder what other drugs work that way. I took mushrooms. I could make good arguments, I suppose, for mushrooms being legal as well. I took mushrooms when I went to Amsterdam legally, I think they're actually illegal at the time. Doesn't really matter, whatever. I took mushrooms when I was in Amsterdam. I didn't really enjoy them that much. I know loads of people that love hallucinogens, but I'm not that big on the shrooms myself. Just because I don't think I have a very happy kind of mind, and I don't really like my mind being able to do its own thing. But, you know, I wouldn't have been trying mushrooms if it hadn't been for the shit advice that I was given from drugs education at school, the government, my parents, authority figures, about how dangerous and horrible cannabis was. Similarly, I then went on to take ecstasy for about 3 years in clubs. I've started off having the time of my life, like absolutely euphoric and feeling completely aligned with everyone around me and peaceful and like energetic and just completely overjoyed and brilliant. You know, as time wore on, I started to notice quite detrimental effects, such as not being able to really control the rate of my heart, having heart palpitations, my skin becoming worse, feeling like crap for longer and longer on the come down. And that's why I'm not making an argument to legalise ecstasy. I do feel that there are damaging effects to taking ecstasy, and that should be something that people approach as something which isn't socially acceptable. Although I suppose you could make a lot of the same arguments about ecstasy that I'm making about cannabis. I don't have any interest in seeing any drugs apart from cannabis and possibly mushrooms on the same basis as them being natural and harmless legalised, because I think that's an honest representation in the legal system. You know, heroin kills you, draw won't kill you, weed won't kill you. And the other reason anyway that cannabis is a gateway drug is because there I am at my dealer's house, my friendly dealer that sold me this weed that everyone around me told me was going to be so bad for me and so awful, saying, hey, do you want to buy some pills? Hey, do you fancy doing some shrooms? I would never have known that dealer. I would never have been sitting in his front room in a way to buy drugs if I hadn't already been there to buy cannabis. Yes, cannabis is a gateway drug, and the way to stop cannabis from being a gateway drug is to make it legal. No one claims that smoking cigarettes or alcohol leads on to other drug use. No, because we classify those things as legal, and therefore they don't lead on to illegal drug use. The only reason cannabis leads to illegal drug use, other types of more dangerous drug use, in many instances, is because they have access through the same person to those substances. And, as I say, because the health advice has been so undermined by their own experience with cannabis. So anyway, all of this video has been kind of prompted by, let's say I went to see a man about a dog this evening. And this guy happens to be a cannabis dealer. And he's telling me that far from this kind of horrifying drug ring, you know, Colombian drug ring, getting his weed to sell to, you know, other friendly, you know, socially conscious people in the community, he actually buys it from a granny that grows her own plants. This woman's in her 80s, and her arthritis in her hands is so bad that she has to get her grandson to do the harvest for her, to harvest the plants for her, and prepare, you know, I think she eats it, prepare the kind of fudge and the cookies and things the way that she takes it, to eat it, for her arthritis. And I find it really disgusting that we've got otherwise law-abiding, socially conscious, nice people risking prison sentences to grow a plant which helps their particular illness, such as arthritis, or I know that glaucoma has been irrevocably shown in scientific studies to be the depression behind the eyes dissipates after cannabis use. That causes a lot of pain to people. I see no reason why there shouldn't be at least prescribed medicinal cannabis use. If not complete legalisation, as I say, because there's absolutely, I can't see any good reason for it to be illegal. It irritates me that CRB checks, which is a Criminal Records Bureau check, which you'll have if you're ever wanting to work with children, for example, if you want to become a teacher, show up cannabis warnings. So in Britain you've got 3 warnings in your out kind of cannabis system. Like the first couple of times you get a warning, and the third time I think you come up, or the second time you might get a fine, and the third time you get called up in court. And then you can go to prison after you've had 3 warnings. Well, I actually have a cannabis warning myself. It's a really long story, but basically, well, I don't think it really needs to be said, but right, I was suicidal. My flatmate called university security called the police, and I ended up in a police cell overnight. I can't quite work out why that was. I wasn't just taken to the local hospital. The police told me that it was because there was no emergency psychiatrist on call at the local hospital, that I was in a police cell overnight. It was a very traumatic experience. Anyway, it just so happened that when I was picked up by the police, kind of on my way to kill myself, I had cannabis in my pocket. And I ended up getting and rightly so, they sent me home the next day without warning, but a week later they came onto campus and gave me this cannabis warning because I had been caught red-handed with an illegal substance. I don't dispute that, that's fine. Does that really mean that okay, this has turned into a bad example because now you're going to think because she was suicidal she shouldn't work with children. But imagine that had been, say, my boyfriend, who's a completely happy person, who's never had any problems with mental health, and he had been picked up randomly with cannabis in his pocket. He wants to become a school teacher. I think he'll make a fantastic school teacher. He wants to use the excellent education that he was given and his own academic acumen that he's demonstrated in his qualifications to help, to not just go back to private school where he comes from and teach those kids, but to teach kids that are deprived in cities. And try and kind of, teach for a lower wage in those state schools to improve state school education. If he had been caught in that situation, should he not be able to work with children? I think he'd be a massive... to be clear, he's never been caught with cannabis. He's not even a cannabis user himself. But if it had been him, should he not be able to work with children? So if cannabis was legal and it was sold through pharmacies, for example, or through newsagents like alcohol and cigarettes are, they could tax highly on that product, and it could be much more expensive than it is on the street, and people would still buy it because it would be a high quality, it'd be a guaranteed quality, a guaranteed weight, the same products every time you buy it. You wouldn't have to put yourself into risky situations. That's another thing. Like, how many times have I had to put myself into risky situations to buy weed? As a 17-year-old girl on her own, walking down into my local, council estate, past gangs of people at night, because that's when the dealer's around, and that's when he's called me and said I can go down there, when really I wouldn't like to be walking through those areas at night on my own at all. If I could have just gone to a newsagent and buy it, I obviously would have, and I would have stocked up during the day, and I wouldn't have been out at night in those dangerous situations and meeting people that I would not want to meet, and being mugged on multiple occasions because I'm trying to buy drugs at the time as well, but that's beside the point. Anyway, had cannabis been legal, I could have gone to my newsagents. That could have been taxed highly. It could be worth a lot more than its street value for that quality, consistent quality. Tax money could go to paying for the NHS expenses of people who, regardless of its legality, are smoking it anyway. Lots of people in Britain use cannabis. Almost everyone I know at university smokes cannabis. All of these people are going to have NHS expenses eventually. Smoking cannabis is very high in tar. It will lead to lung cancer in some people. And the NHS expenses, the social services expenses, social services needed because of drug use and because, of course, gateway drugs, coming on to worse drugs and even social services, drug rehabilitation centres that could be funded by the tax off of cannabis alone, because cannabis has massive sales, and all of that money is just shitted off into the pockets of dealers, rather than the government and the tax. The social change that could be brought about simply by a £1 tax on an eighth of cannabis, an eighth of an ounce that is, of cannabis, is massive. As I say, if it was legal, we could regulate the quality. If cannabis was legal, more problem users would seek help. Wouldn't feel that they might be arrested for coming forward and saying, hey, I have a serious cannabis addiction, I need help with this. Because cannabis, like cigarettes, like alcohol, like gambling, it can be addictive to some people. Those people would feel more able to come forward and seek help for that. Don't just take my word for it. I'd just like to run you through a recent history in the last decade in Britain of some of the changes that occurred and what we could tell from that. In 2004, cannabis was downgraded by the Labour government to a Class C substance. Consequently, there was, quote, a significant fall in its use and, quote, a 50% rise in the number of people seeking medical treatment after using the drug. We see that a 50% rise in people seeking treatment in relation to drug abuse, in relation to that one drug. And just to be clear, classifying cannabis from a Class B to a Class C drug was not legalising cannabis. It was downgrading the type of prison sentence you could expect to receive, downgrading the indication from the government of how dangerous that drug is for you. I think that mushrooms are also Class C, and then heroin is a Class A, for example. Class system's bullshit. On May 7th, 2008, the government decided completely against the advice of their own commissioned report, in the form of Jackie Smith, the Home Secretary, announcing the government's intention to once again reclassify cannabis as a Class B drug. Then Prime Minister Gordon Brown announced that the government would set aside the findings of the committee. So the government commissioned a report. The report came back saying that the cannabis should remain classified as a Class C drug or be decriminalised, effectively legalised. Gordon Brown announces that the government will simply set aside the findings of this committee. Bear in mind that the committee was made up of medical advisors, scientists, people that know better than Gordon Brown what the actual real-world impact, as well as social services and as well as statistical analysis. People who know much better than Gordon Brown and his personal feelings on cannabis use what would be better for the country, and the Labour government decided to completely set aside those findings. And they reclassified cannabis as a Class B substance in January 2009. In November 2009, Professor David Nutt, who was involved in that report, was asked to resign from his position as chairman of the government's Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs by the then Home Secretary Alan Johnson after publishing in a professional journal figures which indicated that cannabis was less harmful than both alcohol and tobacco. So we have professional journal figures, an academic professional publishing in an academic journal his findings and being asked to resign by the government. The result of that was that several other members of the advisory council also resigned in protest, which shows that there were a number of experts on that board who disagreed with I suppose, with scientifically verifiable evidence being silenced, being overlooked. They set up a committee, they asked the committee to go away and find out what the real-world impact of cannabis use is, how dangerous this drug is. They come back saying this is not a dangerous drug, and that actually alcohol and cigarettes, two legal drugs, are much more dangerous, and the government completely sets aside those findings, and in fact several members of the advisory board resign. It's so intellectually dishonest of the government, and most recent development on this is the 21st of March, very recently, 2011. Former heads of the MI5 CPS and the BBC who have helped create with several Lords and MPs a new all-party parliamentary group on drug policy reform. So across the board there are members of all parties calling for drug policy reform. So calling for new policies to be drawn up on the basis of scientific evidence. The war on drugs has failed, say former drugs of MI5, CPS, the BBC and several Lords and MPs. Once again, I think I'd just like to kind of finish with that quote that you don't need any reason at all for something to be legal, but you need a damn good reason to squash people's liberties and being able to partake of that behaviour, a behaviour which isn't hurting anyone around them, a behaviour which, if legalised, could have the last unethical elements of it removed, such as supporting drug circles, etc. A drug that, if legalised, would allow for a massive tax income for the government that could be put towards correcting the effects of that drug use in the way that cigarettes and alcohol are taxed. So we're just like, has anyone actually got an argument as to why cannabis should be legal, should be illegal? Because I'd love to hear it, and I hope you're all well.